Okay, we can see the participants populating right now on the bottom of the screen. Once we see that ticker stop, then we'll get the conversation started.
Okay.
But everybody can hear us right now that is tuned in. So,
Hello, everyone.
yeah, hi everybody.
It's a hot mic. Hello, everybody.
Well, I want to welcome everyone and thank you all for joining our forum today. And I just want to note that it is 4:05 Central Standard Time on Thursday, June 11th, 2020. And if you are one of the members of our director group who's part of the media, just want to remind you that this conversation is to be considered strictly off the record. We are recording this session, but like all of our others, we will defer to the panelists before sharing it. And so, if we do that, it'll be in a few days. But again, if we do it. And I know this isn't necessarily the ideal setting for this type of conversation, but it's the best we can do right now. So I think that this proximity is as powerful as it can be given the setting. And it's been a priority of mine from the beginning to, just continue to build and fortify a real trusting environment for the directors to have the crucial and civil discourse, the crucial conversations and civil discourse that we need to have, and allow each other the space and grace that we need to have those conversations. So I know that I've been given a lot of space and grace during the planning of such, and I would ask everybody tuning in to think about that. A friend in the Lyceum said that like Americans aren't really comfortable talking about race, and we generally enter these conversations with a defensive posture. So I just ask everybody that's tuning in to think about the posture that you have entering this conversation. Every day I think about how to make your Lyceum experience better, and I hope that these forums help us face what needs to change and not necessarily feel better about ourselves, but I do hope they make you feel better about being part of an organization like the Lyceum. And with that said, I want to remind everybody as well that this is not a policy making or a agenda setting organization. This is an organization that informs and provides leaders who have the ability to set agendas and set policy in their sphere of influence. And sometimes that means for the whole state of Texas. Sometimes that means beyond. This conversation in particular, race and racial equity, permeates most, if not all, of the policy issues that we explore. And we need to try our darndest, in my opinion, to make sure that when we're in the leadership of this organization, that we make the most of it for the future of Texas and making Texas more equitable. And then finally, I wanted to just share an observation from Dr. Wayne Chaney, who's a friend of a friend, but we've talked about it in the planning of these calls. It's about proximity and presence, and even in the virtual form, moves us from apathy to empathy. And empathy allows us to have more quality engagement. And, that speaks to what the Lyceum is all about. And with quality engagement, then we might achieve equity. And, I think this is a good example of how we get there. So I just want to thank everyone who's tuned in for giving our moderator and our panelists your presence and proximity today and in the future. Terry, I'm going to turn it over to you and get out of the way now. And thank you for your willingness to have this conversation and guide us through it.
Thank you, Laura. I appreciate not only your leadership, but your willingness to engage in a very tough set of conversations. And the moment where we find ourselves in our nation's history is indeed it's a turbulent one. But in the run up to this conversation, I've been thinking a lot about a place that I hold near and dear to my heart, which is South Africa. I had an opportunity as a college student many years ago now, too many years ago now, to go to South Africa in the aftermath of Mandela's election. And I remember being there. One of the things that was talked about from just about everyone I met was the need to confront the realities of an ugly past and to tell the truth. And what that eventually grew into was a formal Truth and Reconciliation Commission that the country commissioned to essentially confront the wrongs of the past and to shed light on the atrocities that had been committed against Black South Africans and South Africans of color during apartheid, which was a period of state-sanctioned violence against those people. And what was interesting is that the truth part of it, the truth-telling part of it, preceded the reconciliation. There couldn't be any reconciliation until there was truth-telling. There were no prosecutions, there was no recrimination, just truth-telling. And that's part of why we're here today, to hear the truth told of 4 men of color, African-American men who happen to be directors of the Texas Lyceum, and to recount our lived experiences. I think it's important to note that all of us believe in the promise of America, and that promise is nowhere more embodied than in the Declaration of Independence. It's the great line from Jefferson that all men are created equal. And that sense of equality is really a universal striving, that no life should be any more valuable or any less valuable than any other life. Yet for too many people who look like me, that promise has really been illusory. So we have to be honest that race and racism is a part of our culture. It's everywhere. It's in our laws. The very Constitution that we hold dear enshrines the concept that African Americans were not even a whole person, but 3/5 a person. Race and racism, it's in our advertisements on TV. It's literally on the internet and our communities that we live in that continue to be segregated. Even the very school that my daughter goes to, race is there. It's in our scientific experiments, our language, and everywhere that we look, we see race. And most tellingly, I think for this conversation, it's in our justice system. So I say all that to say that we have a problem, and part of solving that problem is being clear about what the problem is. So I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say, and Laura will certainly echo these comments, that I was very reluctant to have this conversation. This is not something that I spend a lot of time thinking about in my day. It's probably how I've been socialized through generations and generations of African-American people and others, but mostly Black men who taught me, you persevere. But I have this conversation today because I feel a sense of obligation and a sense of duty for those who've come before me to have the conversation. And whatever reluctance I've had pales in comparison to what was asked of my forebears. So on those shoulders, that's why in part I have this conversation. So I think it's needless to say here, this conversation it's raw, it's deeply personal. And you'll hear some of that rawness today from my friends and my colleagues. It is, in fact, a conversation that doesn't come easily for many of us. There's a lot of anger that is associated with having this type of conversation, but I promise you, whatever it is, it will be honest. And this conversation, the type of conversation that we're having today, really can only go forward, to echo Laura's sentiments, it can only go forward with grace and with a lot of empathy. And those are the pillars upon which I hope we can build our conversation today. So before we get started in earnest, I just want to set a couple of ground rules. This is a panel that's going to reflect kind of a roundtable discussion. There are a series of questions that we've explored, upon which we will base the conversation today. Questions are absolutely allowed, and I do encourage each of you to submit questions through the chat box feature here on Zoom. But I'm going to hold those questions until the end of our conversation. So what I'd like to do is take the first 60 minutes to have this conversation, this dialogue, and then after that time, we'll take questions. And in fact, at that point, the last 30 minutes, for those who want to stay on, Mary Beth will open the floor, and any director who wants to ask questions live or make comments, that certainly will be available to you as we go through the discussion. So with all that being said, let's start. So Glenn, I'd like to just start by asking you and then the others here, talk to us a few minutes about your bio. What's the story of Glenwood Hill?
Thank you, Terry. And again, thank you all directors for taking the time out and join us on this important and difficult topic to discuss. It's good to be able to talk with you about, give you a little background about me. I'm a 2020 class director. I grew up on a farm in middle Georgia. I showed cows in 4-H and FFA and had leadership roles on county, district, and national level of 4-H. Went through high school, played sports, debate, went to undergrad, Florida A&M University, historically Black university in Tallahassee. From there, I spent 8 years as a U.S. Army officer in the Medical Service Corps. I had the distinct pleasure of leading soldiers down in Fort Sam Houston as a company commander, one of the largest companies in the United States, MedCom down there. Had tons of experiences there, and it was time to separate from the Army after 8 years and went to law school at UT, University of Texas in Austin. There, had a great education, wrote on to law review, and was recruited at V&E in Dallas. Was there for about 4 years, then moved over to Bracewell, and about 3 years ago, I went in-house to be an assistant general counsel. So pretty divergent career, lots of career paths and twists and turns, but an experience that's not dissimilar from any other director here in this fine organization. So that's my background.
And you had the good sense not to be a Marine, so congratulations. All
One
right.
tough.
Bruce, what about you? What's your story?
Well, born and raised in Beaumont, Texas, Southeast Texas. Went to University of a bachelor's degree in mathematics. Later worked as in process engineering for years for IBM and another prototype lab. To the DFW, moved to finance, trained on Wall Street and was a stockbroker for 3 years, and then pivoted into investment bank the last 14 years, and helped clients raise about 20 billion in debt capital to date. And more than anything else, I'm still that down home Southern country kid from Beaumont at heart.
And Bruce, most importantly to your narrative, you are a member of which class?
Oh, almost certainly. Fire.
Yeah, fire in the hole, indeed. Mike, what about you? What's the story of Mike Grace?
Well, went to a predominantly Black high school here in Dallas, Texas, and graduated, well, I won't say the year, but anyway, class of 2017, I guess I should have started with that. Went to community college first and got my associate's degree. And then from there, I went on to the University of Oklahoma, where I majored initially in meteorology and changed that to geography, and then got my master's in regional and city planning, and then started my career. And some years later, I went back and got a certificate in economic development through the University of Oklahoma's Economic Development Institute as well. And then continued my career, of course. So I've worked primarily in local government. So I've been in city government, large, medium, and small size city governments. Currently work for Dallas County as Director of Unincorporated Area Services. I've done a little bit of writing, had a couple things published, a few things published, I guess, at this point. And I am a part of I'm also on the board of directors of the Greater Dallas Planning Council, serving as the vice president on the executive committee, which I've done for 4 years now, I think. On a couple of the boards. I'm on the Trinity Coalition Board, which is an organization that's tasked with advocating for the Trinity River watershed, which runs from basically from Wichita Falls down to east of Houston. I'm on the city of Duncanville, which is where I live. City of Duncanville's Economic Development Corporation Board. I'm president of the Duncanville Tax Increment Finance District number 1. And I was just recently appointed to the North Central Texas Economic Development District Board. And that's enough.
So I used to joke that I've been on pretty much every board that I can think of in Houston, but clearly I have not done enough compared to what you've done, Mike. So
Pretty bored, pretty busy, I should say.
absolutely. Well, and it goes without saying, you guys know Terry Bruner on the wonderful class of 2019. So there's a fire in the hole here. I will just fast forward to kind of what I do. So my day job, I'm a transactional lawyer, managing attorney of a firm here in Houston, TBLO Counsel and Consulting. We're a boutique firm that represents clients, apartment developers, particularly around financing from the federal government. I've grown the firm to be one of the highest grossing firms in that sector for the Southwestern United States. Pretty proud of that. I also run a family-owned real estate investment company. And I've also been on the adjunct faculty for the University of Houston downtown, the School of Business for the last 5 years. Like Glenn, a veteran of the United States Army, service-connected disabled vet. Been a lot of things in my life. Worked at the State Department with a top secret security clearance. I started my professional life as a 4th grade teacher in Teach for America, an organization that I later had the privilege of running the Houston office. And most significantly, I met my wife there as a very young man. So I say I was a horrible teacher, but it brought me the best thing in the world that I've ever been. Most significantly, though, guys, I'm the husband of Nadia, as I said, father of Nala, and son of Debbie and Terry Sr., and the grandson of Grant, Sarah, Joe, Conley, and Daisy. And I want to start with those grandparents because all of my grandparents on both sides of the family, great and grandparents, came from Mississippi. My grandfather in particular, my maternal grandfather came from a place called Grenada, Mississippi. He left at 8 years old, and he settled in a little town in Oklahoma. So my family has roots in Oklahoma and Texas. But he settled in this little town, and he never went back to Mississippi. And I remember once asking him, why didn't you go back to Mississippi? Because I don't think he ever went back. And he commented to me that there was nothing for a Black man in Mississippi. And over the course of my time knowing my grandfather and all of my grandparents, they would oftentimes speak roundly about these topics and these subjects that I later came to know formally at Howard, through people that I studied. And so there are two kind of thinkers that I'm really thinking about. One is Paul Laurence Dunbar, famously wrote a poem, and he talked about Black people, we wear this mask that grins and lies. And then the famous scholar W.E.B. Du Bois also, famously said that we walk through this life with kind of a double consciousness. And I'm curious for all of us, I've certainly had my experiences of what those things mean, but can you just give us a flavor of what it's actually like to walk around in society in a Black person's skin? Bruce, would you like to start?
Sure. And I want to take one step back with privilege, hopefully. I left out one degree, got my MBA from SMU also. And not to be outdone by the military guys, I did receive an accommodation from the U.S. State Department for helping train the Iraqi delegation when they came to the city of Dallas, right after they were forming the new government, to walk them through how to set up a municipal Iraq and received a certification for that. So I tried to help my country as well. So in my own way. But to talk about the mask, it's not new for anyone of color. I won't even say this is exclusive of African Americans. It's different. every day when we put on our suits or whatever and go out into the world, we have to shelter a certain amount of ourselves in the sense of trying to, assimilate, relate, make conditions as comfortable as possible for the majority of folks in the office place in whatever area that you are, to fit in and again, like this level of comfort. And so what that can mean is, from 8 a.m. till 7 p.m. or whatever, you are restricting a significant portion of yourself into certain things in a normal, sense, and just and you're not reacting to things. You have to, it's called a compiler before and I'm kind of going back into my nerdy engineer something. When you're doing like if you're writing a program, the first thing that happens is you type it in English, and then it goes through a compiler that then translates it into the language that the computer can understand, the operating system. And so to speak, that's kind of what mask. We take in information, and then we have to wait and think. And how do we want to respond, if we want to respond at all, because we want to make sure we do so in such a way where it will conform and it will not cause us to stand out any more so than our causes. And that's exhausting. That's absolute day in, day out. When you walk out the door, what you say, what you wear.
Bruce, your audio is going in and out.
It's exhausting. But I was just saying, it's, as a 45-year-old man, being in professional America for, some 20 odd years, that's absolutely exhausting. I'll just pause right there.
Yeah, and I think the notion of exhaustion is something that I've felt a lot of in this current moment, just having the conversation repeatedly, but it's necessary. Glenn or Mike, do you want to add to your sense of what it's like to wear this mask?
Sure, Terry. So the mask concept is very apropos because, it burns psychic, intellectual, and spiritual calories to maintain that facade, that veneer that oftentimes is required in order to exist and succeed in our professions and in the greater society, the larger society. I want to emphasize, two things that it means to me of being a Black man in this country and wearing Black skin, because it's not to diminish in any way of our Latinx brothers and sisters and African American brothers, African American sisters who also, experiencing this on two levels, right? Of the racial aspect and the sex, the gender aspect. One of those things is it means being characterized solely on first blush, prima facie look. So my first sight, someone sees you, the one thing they're going to see is my Blackness, and then it goes to whatever baggage that person has from society, from images, and we get this imagery from birth. I mean, one of the heartbreaking things that I recognize, and it's one of those things being a parent, you don't realize it being a parent. I remember vividly when my 12-year-old daughter was 3, and she comes home from daycare and she says, "Daddy, why can't my hair be golden?" Or my son looks at me and he says, "Dad, I want peach skin." That's a hard conversation to have. And it's one you shouldn't have to have, but I have to have it because that's what he brings home. That's what she brings home. It's in the milieu. It's on TV. It's on radio, in magazines, newspapers. It's coming at them all the time. This kind of values based, and it's solely based on skin color. so that's the experience all persons of color have. It also means, for me, as a Black man, it means always having to be aware. When I leave the house in the morning, you know, somebody's watching me. Even though I can't see it, somebody's watching me. You have to have your guard up when you're interpreting circumstances. Am I being mistreated? If yes, if I am being mistreated, is it because of race? I mean, it could be just because I'm just a jerk that day, but maybe it's not. So I think about all those things that it takes to interpret, make sure you're not being mistreated or treated unfairly. It's just, go back to Bruce's point, it's exhausting because it's the burning of those calories, and it affects people of color on a cellular level. I mean, there are studies that are showing, from a medical perspective, your resting blood pressure rates for African Americans is higher, several points higher than whites. I mean, these things are happening. It's all a part of weathering. And so I'll stop right there, but that's kind of what the experience means to me.
And it's very real. That anxiety shows up in very real ways. And it's so ironic. My grandmother used to always say to me, you know, as I'd kind of make my way in the world, she'd say, "Baby, be careful, because stress kills people." And you know, obviously when you're 17, 18 years old, you think nothing of it. Your vantage on that, though, over the miles of life changes quite significantly. Mike, do you have anything that you'd like to add on the mask concept?
Well, yes, everything you all said basically, and then, you know, it's like you mentioned earlier, and I've shared with the group. I've struggled with whether or not I wanted to participate in this conversation too, because there's a lot of things that it conjures up, you know, painful things, some things that are just not pleasant. And so, in terms of walking in the Black man's skin, what it's been like, I mean, it's been interesting. Sometimes it's for the good, most times not. But it's everything from, I distinctly remember being in college and I was at Whataburger ordering a burger, and I told the young lady behind the counter I didn't want onions on my burger. Well, she proceeded to tell me that she had been told that Black people didn't like onions. And what struck me about that moment is I didn't know what to say or how to respond to that or what to think. Or it's like, well, I'm the only one in my family that doesn't like onions, but I don't, you know, so I'm, you know, from something that simple to going into an interview that I was obviously qualified for because of my resume, and then walking into an office that was full of a bank of offices made of glass so that everyone could see everything and everyone. And the person that was scheduled to interview me never came out to interview me. And I asked about it 3 times and was sent to a room to wait. And then a young kid came in. He was about 24, 25 years old. He said he had just graduated from college. And we had a great conversation, he and I. And he asked to see my resume, and I showed it to him. And he was very impressed with it. And I was obviously more qualified than he, but nobody ever came to actually do the interview. And there weren't any faces of color in that office. So, you know, so that, you know, there are times when you are, or I have been in spaces and places in which, you know, your work is constantly questioned, or it's not recognized, or it's attributed to someone else. And you wonder, you know, you can't always prove racism. There's all kinds of shades of it. And so, you know, but then you're pondering that. Sometimes it's very obvious, sometimes it's not, but then you have that thought, and that's energy. Back to Glenn's point, there's energy and it has an impact on you. So it's a whole range of things.
Yeah, and you know, as I think about the moment we're having, and I want to turn a little bit to obviously what we've witnessed of late over the last couple of weeks. But Glenn, I just want to follow up with you when you talk about how this anxiety affects you as a person of color, as a Black man on the cellular level. You know, it's striking to me that so many of our experiences really are shared experiences that are shared and struggle really passed down through the generations. So you look at the long arc of generational history, so many of the fears that my grandparents had from my father, for example, you know, things like, are you going to make it home at night? We still face many of those same fears. They look a little bit different. Our neighborhoods look a little bit different. We drive, you know, a little bit nicer cars. And we've got a little bit more money in the bank, but the same visceral base level fears and anxieties, they are there unchanged from 3-4 generations prior. I'd love for you to, how does that sit with you when you think about that mirrored against just structural racism and its persistence?
It's heartbreaking. You know, you would think that we're able to get beyond this fiction that's been foisted upon us as a people. I mean, and I'm talking about all Americans. We all suffer under this scheme, under this structural racism scheme, Black and white. Our Latinx brothers and sisters, our Asian and Pacific Islanders, all people suffer under this scheme. You know, I think back where I grew up in Middle Georgia, outside of Atlanta, but north of the Deep South, where my parents grew up, Deep South Georgia, that is, where my parents grew up. My father was basically, for all intents and he was the chairman of the Board of County Commissioners, elected 2 terms, which is the functional equivalent of the county judges system here in Texas. And I distinctly remember in my dad's reelection campaign, his signs being burned. You know, this isn't 1965. This is 1982. And my father in the early 70s was going to pursue his PhD at the University of Georgia, and the University of Georgia would not admit him to that program for agriculture, and actually paid for him to go to get his PhD out of the state of Georgia. This isn't 100 years ago. This is, 45, almost 50 years ago when this happened. So it's been with us. We continue to deal with that. My high school, when I graduated, we had a segregated prom in 1992.
Wow.
So these things, it affects us in so many levels. These things, the not being able to be your true, authentic self because of those tropes. You don't want to raise your voice because you don't want to be the angry Black male. You don't want to, right? You want to be able to stand up and defend yourself, stand up for yourself. It means going through gaslighting. I mean, I'll just say this. I'm just going to put it out here. I'm just going to say this. It's amazing to me, and this is for everybody, but all the directors who might not be aware of this, we're, at least on current news reports, is there's going to be a rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma on June 19th. Now let's step back and think about this for a minute. We can talk, people can ask me questions about it offline if you don't understand the cultural significance of Juneteenth to African Americans. But that was the date that African Americans in Texas, the last slaves in Texas, realized that they had been emancipated 2.5 years previously, read by a Union general. Tulsa, Oklahoma was the site of the Tulsa Massacre, where the Black Wall Street neighborhood of influential and affluent African Americans in 1920 was burned to the ground. Now, regardless of where you're coming from, to me, having a rally in Tulsa on June 19th is not, it doesn't fail to send me a message. And people might say, hey, you're overreacting. That's part of the legacy of racism and how I have to filter things. And I shouldn't have to filter those types of things that way. That shouldn't even, somebody should be able to stand up and say, hey, that's not a good look.
And it raises a very interesting point about lived experiences, right? It's very difficult to refute someone's lived experiences. Even when you may disagree with the position, the experience remains what it is based on how you've lived your life. So I'd like to just pivot a little bit and take things to the current moment. So, I think most of the country, probably including all 4 of us, we've seen that heart-wrenching video from Minneapolis. George Floyd, a man who was raised and reared here in the heart of 3rd Ward in Houston, Texas, his life was taken from him. And I'm just, I guess my question is, when you saw the video and how gut-wrenching it was, how did it make you feel? But knowing how it made you feel, I guess the real question for the moment is, why is this time different? I mean, we've seen other Black men, countless numbers of other Black men some of whom we don't even know because it hasn't been publicized. We've seen other Black men's lives being taken by either police officers or in the context of extrajudicial killings. So what is it about this moment that's different, and how does that sit with you? Bruce, I'd like to start with you on this one.
Sure. So my initial reaction when I watched the video, and I watched it in its totality, I cried. I think I might have started crying within the first 2 minutes, and I couldn't stop till the end. It was deeply painful for me, and reflecting on it even today, it's very painful because that was a father. He was a provider, a human being, and I don't understand why it would take 8 minutes and 46 seconds to restrain someone when he was obviously restrained. Why not just put him in the car and take him to the police station? I couldn't, and forever that family is affected, and that's so sad. And it was such a minor offense. I was so confused and hurt at the same time. And I'll pause there with that reaction and move on to your second question of why is this thing different? Well, first of all, because of social media and all the the outlets, the world saw this, the entire world. So there was no way to deny it. It could not. The entire world saw this. And then on the heels of extremely recent, police killings, or just killings, I'll say, with Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, and the killed, just living their life. A gentleman just jogging down the street for exercise. A lady sleeping in her bed and being killed. She was shot 8 times. That doesn't sit well with me. That shouldn't sit well with anybody. And it's so personal for me because I'm sure like many of you, I've been stopped more times than I can remember for with this driving while Black, because there have been several times I've been stopped where they didn't even tell me what I did. And this whole heightened sense of extreme police violence in some cases has been some years ago. My ex-wife took my car registration and insurance and placed it in this little pouch and placed it on the passenger side visor in a little holder, to where if I'm ever stopped, just just slide down the visor and the information's right there. I just turn and can hand it to the police. And me being a creature of habit, forever, that information was always in my glove box. That's where it was. I knew where it was. That, just living my life. And so when she did that, I was like, no, I don't want it there. I want to put it back in my glove box. That's where it's always been. That's where I like it. I know it. And instantly she looked at me when tears started welling, and she said, if you get stopped, I just want you to come home. And I couldn't say anything.
Yeah, it takes me back some years ago, but my own personal experience. I was at a training at the University of Houston, here locally, and at that time I was driving an old Volvo. I mean, literally, it was an old Volvo, and there were someone. I guess the car was parked in the parking lot, and the windows of another car had been broken out or something. I don't even know if that's true. There was glass around the car. And so when I came out of my training, I was looking around the car to make sure nothing was wrong, because I obviously saw glass on the ground. literally, after inspecting the car, I get in the car and I drive away, and literally couldn't have been 2 minutes long. 2 minutes later, I'm driving down, Wheeler. If you know anything about, Houston, so Wheeler runs right beside, street right beside U of H. And I started hearing all these sirens. I couldn't figure out what was going on. I thought maybe there was like someone in distress, or there was a fire or something. And it dawned on me that the sirens and the flashing lights, they were coming towards me. And literally 4 police cars pulled in front of me, cut me off from the other side of the traffic. I had to slam on the brakes. These guys get out, guns blazing. I'm in like flip flops and jeans, and they immediately asked me, where'd I get the car? And my response was, it's my car. It's an old Volvo, the same one I've had since college. I didn't, and I'm chuckling about it now because it's so preposterous. Long story short, without them ever asking for registration, license, or anything, they get me out of the car, they handcuff me, they put me in the back seat of the car, of one of the squad cars, and then they parade me around. I guess for some reason they couldn't figure out, whatever they were looking for. They then put me against the hood, the trunk on the back of the patrol car. And there I am, it's hot, it's summer in Houston. And they kept me out there for, I guess, maybe 30 minutes before they finally recognized that what I'd been telling them is true, that the car was mine, that I had a valid license. And all they ever said was, oh, it was wrong. Well, they didn't say it was wrong. They said, we had the wrong guy. But they said, you matched the description. And what I later found out was that a white woman who had been watching all of this from up above in Moody Towers, which was the dorm, the parking lot where my car was parked, she had been watching this and made the assumption that because there was a Volvo, what appeared to be a black man in broken glass, I stole the car. And on that alone, there they were looking for me. And that's the sort of visceral reaction that I think so many men of color have. And it's the very reason why to this day, when I leave the house, my wife always tells me, make sure you have your cell phone on you. And when I call, make sure you answer just so that I know you're okay. And that's the very same thing in part that my mother used to tell me when I'd leave her house as a teenager. Mike, I'm interested to hear from you. What were your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts, honestly, when I saw the footage of Floyd on the ground, honestly, my first thought was, they're really trying to get rid of us. They're trying to kill us all. That was my initial thought. And, because of all the other stories that Glenn has the other scenarios and situations where people of color have lost their lives because of all those things. And then I thought, I thought of other things that are related to Black people and people of color, and how our access to the voting, to the voting booths have been limited over the past, starting to be limited again over the past, several years, efforts to do that. I thought about, why is this continuing to happen without something being done? Of course, at that moment, I didn't know it would turn into what it's turned into now, as as part of the fallout. And then I thought about, we're supposed to be the greatest country in the world, and yet this is happening to our own people. And then I thought about the fact that whatever happens needs to be big and huge, because one of the things that assisted the civil rights movement was the advent of television. And America's sins began to be on full display across the world at that time. And so here we are today.
Glenn, do you have a story of either being targeted or profiled by law enforcement? You're a man who's obviously worn the cloth of our nation, but do you have similar experiences, and how did the, go ahead, Mike.
Sorry, I didn't get to that part. I'm sorry. Yes, I've been profiled by police. There's most of my, unfortunately, as a citizen, first of all, most of my experiences with police have been negative. And so that's just a general problem, right? And then in terms of being profiled by police, yes, I've been pulled over by police for no apparent reason. I've been pulled over by police when I was speeding, and then proceeded to have my, complete vehicle checked and stuff pulled apart and opened and everything, looking for something, and I've never been in trouble. I've never even tried marijuana. I've never even smoked a cigarette. So to go through that, and that's happened several times, throughout my life. I've been I've been with people and singled out by police, and I was the only Black person in the bunch. So I mean, it's yes, I have been profiled. Sorry, Glenn.
No. So I have to admit that I've been so much more fortunate than the rest of my panelists here. My encounters with police, with law enforcement, have generally been neutral to positive. My parents sheltered me. I'll be the first one to admit, my parents sheltered me, and my father drilled into me what, the talk that everybody talks about. And
that's the birds and the bees conversation, right?
Exactly. Okay. the real bees, the beatitudes of how to be nice to the law enforcement officer when they show up. So, I was protected by, in a certain sense, growing up with the shield of my parents in the community. Where I grew up, there was a historically Black college there. Father was a professor. It was a professor there. My mom taught in school. When he was elected again to the county commissioners, everybody knew who their children were in the community. So I kind of had that functional shield when I did have an encounter. I'm named after my father, and that those things have interceded to protect me to a large extent. Now, what I will say, and I want to get to this thing about what makes this moment different, but I do want to say, when I saw that video, it took me back to a moment, again, drives home how just pernicious our system is here. At the birth of both of my children, that birth of anybody's child is one of the seminal moments in a parent's life, in a person's life. And I experienced it to a certain extent with my daughter, who's my firstborn, but I experienced it when my son was born, when Josh was born. The moment is supposed to be this awe-inspiring moment of, you got this new life, you're holding them, you're going to be responsible for them, this is a beautiful day. I had that thought. The very next thought was, oh my God, I have a Black son that I got to figure out how to keep safe. Colored the entire moment. And I carry that moment with me every day. Just like I'm sure my father carries it for me and my brother. It's just pernicious. But when I will say this, one of the reasons why I think this is different, so I think we're at a real cultural change. It's a generational change. You look at the protests. I took my kids out to a family protest on Sunday. I looked all around, and you look at the hues, and you looked at the ages of the people who were marching. And now the conclusion, the end result is a little bit different, so just bear with me for a minute. But it reminded me of the period just before, or right near the end of Republican Rome. There was a generational change from the landed class, the conflict of the plebeians and the wealthier class. And people noticed this generational change. They said that the people in the younger generation that had different values, didn't have the old values of old Republican Rome. They wore their togas loose fitting. That's how there was like, yes, you said, the commentator said, these are new kids. They dressed different. They wore their hair different. They had different values. And I think with us here at this moment, we have young kids that have come up with a cultural aspect on TikTok, NBA, sports, music. These kids are more, they are more blended together than anything. Media, and these children are seeing, hey, I've got friends of all different colors and races, and this is not right. These young people are going out in the streets, and they're taking them. And that's why I think that there might be an opportunity for this to be different. You add to that, people were on lockdown because of coronavirus, a lot of pent up angst and pent up energy. And I think that makes it different here than what we've seen previously, what we've experienced previously.
So it's a good point. And the point about this generation being much more mixed, much more integrated socially in a way that prior generations, probably even than our generation was or has been, I think is a key moment. But that being said, we still continue to see instances of racism in our society. And I just wonder, how do we reconcile those competing notions? That on the one hand, we have this younger generation that is so blended in so many ways malleable, and kind of the embodiment of the melting pot that we all hold so near and dear. Yet we continue to see a rise of the very things that our grandparents and great grandparents feared.
I'll jump in there. It is hard to square that circle. It really is. Only to say that racism itself is a symptom of the larger hierarchy that we have to deal with, structural racism. So you don't have to deal with, it's not enough to look at taking care of the individual bad actors, right? Because systems can create outcomes. You can take good people and put them in bad systems and have bad outcomes, right? You can always have bad people in good systems and have bad outcomes. But we have a structural hierarchy that lends itself to these bad outcomes. And it's really something that's going to have to require being rooted out, taken out, root and branch. And in order to avoid this being passed on to the next generations. So it happens at home. People talk about, we look at Sunday. Sunday is the most segregated day in America. Mm-hmm. It requires more than, there's a couple of books out there. I think Tim Wise, the professor, he was actually on a video in our Waco meeting. Tim Wise was talking about housing, and he talks about it's not enough to not be racist. You have to be anti-racist. It's not enough to not be racist. You have to be anti-racist. So that requires an affirmative, a positive action of saying, I'm not going to pass this on to my kids, and I'm going to intervene when I see things that take place and nip it in the bud, whether it's my friend or member of my social group or member of my church or member in my executive board room. When I see these types of circumstances in play, I'm going to step up to stop it there.
So I want to be respectful of time. We're getting close, and I knew this hour would fly by. But I really want to end on this question. And Glenn, you and Mike, you and Bruce in particular, I want to hear your thoughts. All of us, live in a bifurcated society in many respects, and we all have many white friends, many Anglo friends, many of whom come from within this organization. The next time you sit down with one of your white friends, what is it that you really want him or her to know about this moment, about your experience, about how to move forward?
Well, I just think there's a lot of things that are complicit in all of this. And I think that everyone needs to have a level of awareness, and something that, I've heard many Black people say recently was like, well, what can we do? What can be done? We need to do this, needs to do that. White people need to take ownership of racism because we didn't create that. That's not us. We don't own that and stuff like that. I just, just greater conversations and greater awareness of the role that you can play, and people need to take, if possible, and if so inclined, and hopefully people are, to take responsibility for this. I think we all have a responsibility to take care of this country and to make it the best it can be. And it can only be the best it can be if we're all part of that, right? And so we talk about systemic racism in different places and spaces and institutions, and these institutions and spaces and places are made up of people, and these people make policies and implement policies. And so people need to be held accountable for that. If something is not fair, I mean, it's like the saying goes, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And that is absolutely true. And at some point, the things that are wrong that's impacting particular groups of people is going to in some way impact all of us at some point. And so we just need to, I mean, it's 2020, we're too far along to not know that and accept that and embrace that as a people.
And really, in the sake of time, Terry, I don't want to go.
No, take your time.
Well, just really quickly, people just need to understand that, again, like Mike said, to place yourself in the shoes. What we've been here through slavery since 1619, so 401 years. We're as a people, we're not asking for a handout. We don't want a handout. All we're asking for is a fair shot. We want a level playing field in all regards, to be free to be yourself, to the fullest extent of your creativity, your imagination, to live a very productive life, free from any hindrance because of the color of your skin. Yeah, that's the goal. Just to be able to fully compete in this world without any unnecessary barriers. And how do you get there? That's a multi-generational. In addition to policy change, that's definitely a multi-generation, and it requires people who have been in the dominant role to want to, acquiesce, and that's what it is absolutely required in this case.
And I want to add one other statement, and above all, any human being deserves to feel safe, in America, anywhere, walking down the street, and certainly at home. And so I just want to make sure that that's that we make that audible.
Well, again, I want to thank all of you for your thoughts and your time, your attention. I want to allot some time for questions as promised. I do want to end this portion of the discussion with a brief video. It sounds, I think, an optimistic note, something of an optimistic note. And Mary Beth is going to cue up a video. It's from T.D. Jakes, no stranger to any of us in Texas or around the country. But it's important, I think, in moments such as these to maintain not only grounding, but as people of color, particularly Black people, so much of our experience has been rooted in faith. And that's no different for me. One of my favorite passages of scripture comes from the Old Testament prophet Micah. And it's really a passage that I try to live true to every day. And the question is asked of the prophet, what does God require of you? And the response comes back as to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. And I think as an organization and as a people, if we can try to live true to those values, that should be something I think that will push us forward and hopefully give us even more reason to hope in this moment where there is some reason to hope already. So Mary Beth, if you have that video, let's go ahead and show that. And then Laura, from there, we can take questions. I can't hear.
Yeah, Laura, you're muted. I don't know if that's why it's not playing.
Mary Beth, can you unmute your computer?
Oh, Mary Beth. Okay.
Yes, sorry about that. Here we go. I'll start it over without the ad.
Uh-huh.
This week have communicated their passion and their pain. Earlier tonight, I spoke with Bishop T.D. Jakes, the Texas pastor with the global reach, offering spiritual comfort. Bishop Jakes, thanks so much for being with us. It has been a long few months because of COVID-19. It has been a long week because of what happened to George Floyd. What do you say to people after such an incredibly difficult, painful 10, 11 days?
After 8 weeks of being sheltered in place, we came out the door to multiple murders, lack of jobs, shaking the economy, all of that simultaneously is a lot to handle. I try to encourage them that we'll get through this, that we're strong people, that we're a strong country, and that somehow or other we will survive the atrocities of this current moment. I realize we've never seen anything quite like this in our generation, in our lifetime. History has taught us that we have been here before, and we have overcome it before, and we are strong and resilient and committed to truth. We'll get through it again.
You've been engaged in these kinds of issues for a very long time, and even you think this moment is different. Why?
It is not the murders that are different. The murders have been going on all the time, and they're shocking to the general populace, but not to us. It's just that the ones that are caught on camera become more well known, but there are many more that are never caught on camera. What is different, though, is to look on the television and see masses of white people walking with black people and brown people. I can't even articulate to you what that says to us, that to acknowledge that our lives matter and that our pain matters and that it matters beyond the shores of our communities and the demographics of our zip code.
As you know, so many people are angry. There's pain across this nation. How would you suggest people channel that frustration?
We have to channel the anger into action. I might also underline the fact that anger is a part of grief, and we are still in the process of burying George Floyd.
Now, I ask this next question, Bishop, thinking of my late grandmother who would always say, God doesn't put heavy burdens on weak shoulders. Our country is dealing with a confluence of crises, right? A pandemic, the collapse of the economy, and now racial protests. When is enough enough?
The pandemic took us all by surprise, and it brought with it the economic conundrum that we find ourselves in. As it relates to the social unrest, it has been coming to a head for years, but the voice of this generation has risen to such a pitch that it cannot be ignored. We're starting to see some real change.
Bishop, I think I hear optimism in your voice.
If you had interviewed me a couple of weeks ago, you would hear none at all, but I am encouraged that the other 3 officers have been arrested. I am encouraged that the legal proceedings for Brother Arbery has been underway. I am encouraged by the resilience of the young people who will not be deterred in peaceful demonstrations making a difference.
You seem to say that you've been frustrated, that you've been angered, perhaps pained by what's happened.
I have shed tears about what's happened. I've been angry. I've shed tears about what happens. It hurts terribly. To be honest, I have children. I have sons. I know what it is to be terrified of what's going to happen to my sons with the police or what's going to happen to me. And to have that in front of us, I won't lie. There's an art to faith. There's fear before faith. And I think that through it all, I think that we're going to come out better if we continue in the path we're going and we do not allow the naysayers to rise up and get the wheel of the destiny of this country again. I think we can build a better America. It may not ever be a perfect America, but I do believe we could build a better America in this particular moment of time.
Bishop T.D. Jakes, always grateful, sir.
We still have 49 participants.
Thank you, everybody. So, Laura, I will turn it to you for questions. I don't know if we have some curated questions that have already been posed. But if we could just open up the floor so that people could ask live questions or make comments, that would be helpful.
You guys can use the Q&A feature or the raise your hand button if you want to just ask your question live. We've had several comments and in the chat, and just want to make sure that you guys see the notes of appreciation that have been shared. So if you haven't seen them, they're in the chat box.
I'll say out loud in case somebody didn't see this, but Michael Crane has posted a link. Opal Lee in Fort Worth is leading an effort to make Juneteenth a national holiday. And there is a link in the chat box for a person to make a donation. If you like, you don't have to give your name to be on the petition. Shared by Michael Crane. Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Crane.
All right. We have a question about how we move forward. So the question is, how do we ensure this is not a week or a few months of effort?
Does anyone want to take that in particular?
I would like to say.
All right, Mr. Grace.
I think it goes back to what I said earlier. You have to be, we all have different things pulling our attention from day to day. We have families and jobs and stresses and all that stuff. But as a society, I think we all have to take ownership of our parts in these issues because they play themselves out, whether we're on a board, we're at work, we're in a circle of friends, we're at a restaurant. It comes with accountability of family members, sense of awareness. We got to teach our kids, teach each other to be more sensitive in awareness and empathize and understand how nothing starts overnight. And so you have to, this is something that you'll just have to work at being aware of and practicing and incorporating into who you are as a person if it's already not there.
I'll jump in as well. First of all, I want to thank again our leadership, Laura, Executive Committee, also the directors for dialing in today. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for all the comments. I really appreciate it. I want to say a couple things about how to make sure this is not just a temporary occurrence and how we stretch this out. The reason why I was doing this is to hopefully have a spark empathy in each one of us. All right. So individually we go out and we take care of things we can do on our own. And it's hard when you're sitting around across a family member who's saying something that in your heart, is uninformed or not, or unempathetic to stop that person or to say, hey, let's talk about this or look at it a different way to challenge that person. But everybody's got to do that. At home, in your social organizations, your spheres of influence. You have to take up the mantle if you want to be part of the change. Second of all, vote. Okay, there's going to be challenges out there. People standing in long lines. You got to vote. You got to encourage other people to vote. You got to be active and try to figure out why certain access to voting is being curtailed or made more challenged in different communities. It takes some active research to figure that out and get that information and figure out what we can all do about that. So those are two strong things I can think of to help this move forward. And then just be an example. Be an example for these younger people that are trying to take up the mantle and help forge us to a better place.
May I jump in here, Terry?
You may, yeah.
I want to touch on something Glenn just brought up about voting. Many of us, at least in this country, it seems, are 1 or 2 issue voters. And that's one of the things that's holding back lots of things in this country, let alone race relations, but the funding for education, transportation, healthcare, all kinds of things are being held back by people focusing on 1 or 2 issues and voting on that one thing. Our world is too interconnected and dynamic to, in my opinion, to vote that way. So my added 2 cents to that, what Glenn has said, is that we become more well-rounded and educated and engaged citizens so that we can vote accordingly.
Bruce, did you want to add anything? Okay. We had a question. Well, Mike, I have a question for you real quick, because earlier you said in your remarks about using your voice, and when you were answering the question about what we can do. And I think you've mentioned several times this philosophy of personal responsibility. And you said, if it is not there, and I think you were referring to, if you are being an advocate in a conversation, but when you said, if it is not there, I guess my question is, how can you develop awareness of your biases or your lack of understanding or empathy?
I think one can, first of all, start asking yourself the question. I mean, just be more aware, number one. And then two, I'll share this story real quickly. I taught community college. I didn't mention this in my bio earlier, but I taught community college a few years ago, several years ago now. And I taught at a predominantly minority, mostly Black community college campus. And so I taught developmental reading, which is very interesting in itself. But one of the things I made sure to mention to them repeatedly throughout the semesters was that be sure that you make an effort to make your circle of life as diverse as possible. Because you need to know, moving forward in your life and in your career, and as you engender certain things into your children, that you are able to deal with different races, people from different places and spaces and backgrounds and cultures. You need to know how to do that, because that will increase your level of awareness of things that you may not encounter in your day-to-day. So if your wedding album photo book is all one race of people or all whatever, then you probably have some significant blind spots. Because that means that your circle of your close circle of contacts and people that you engage with and interact with and experience your life with are not diverse. And so you're probably you may not be a very open-minded or aware person. So I just think, again, that's part of a person making a personal effort to have that.
And I see in the chat, Feiruz mentioned an example that really goes to inclusion. And I think this is an important point. What gets lost sometimes in conversations such as these is that diversity is sort of the only thing that matters, and diversity is critically important. But diversity without an inclusive environment where people actually feel welcome, where they feel empowered, and where they have agency and where they speak up, like that should live in every aspect of our society. And there are overt ways in which you can actually enshrine those into policies, no matter where you are, no matter what station of life you're in. And I think that's critically important. So to this question of how do you keep the momentum going, so much of my life, I've learned that change really happens, sort of like water beating against a rock. It doesn't immediately create a cliff. But over time, if you beat hard enough and you beat consistently enough against it, things actually do, there is a cliff or there is something that's created. So I think we've got to be committed to the long-term work per se, but also being consistent and not just allowing the moment to come and go. And so much of what we see, I think generationally with social media and other things, is when the hashtag stops trending, the issue goes away. And you've got to be consistent about whatever it is you do in order to sustain a moment, this moment or any other moment.
Terry, did you see Nicole's question?
I did not.
She asked that the Houston police chief mentioned that the U.S. has over 1,500 police departments. What's one state policy that would have an impact? What one state policy would have an impact?
Does anyone want to take that? So Bruce, I know you come from a law enforcement family. Your grandfather. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I didn't even get into that whole story. No, what I would rather do right quick is just to give a very easy for everyone who's not of color, of something that you can do to advance this movement. And it's quite simple. Read a book. And the book that I would refer you to, Robin DiAngelo. She's a white
White fragility.
social justice educator. Yeah. And so she's coming from the standpoint of a white person of what it is they can do. First and foremost, understanding the innate systemic racism and racist motivations that are within, whether you're aware of them or not. And then, well, what do you do now that you have this awareness? So that's what I would recommend, white fragility. But then to talk to what can the police do, elaborate a little, just very briefly on where Terry was going. So my grandfather, my maternal grandfather's name was Buster Turner. And he was one of 4 Black police that were hired in 1953 to integrate Beaumont Police Department. And so at that time, he was not allowed to arrest white individuals. But what they did, in addition to him going through a lot of, just proverbial crap out to quit, and the other 3, when that wasn't successful, then they had him serve warrants in Vidor, Texas. So for anyone who's not really aware of Vidor, Texas, it's the southern capital of the KKK. And so I remember stories of my grandfather telling me of when he used to go to serve these warrants, and he'd go after he leave the main road, and now he's driving on these dirt roads and literally passing by a tree, a burnt tree with a noose on it, en route to go to this house to arrest this white person in Vidor, Texas, in deep woods in Vidor, Texas. Point blank, the goal was they were trying to get him killed. Suffice to say, 35 years later, he retired, received his gold badge, and lived a prosperous life. And if you were to Google his name, you can see a story of the local CBS affiliate ran some broadcast about him when he passed. And there's a small little research section at Lamar University in Beaumont dedicated to him and things that he did. So, but yeah, what can be done? Again, the first thing that they have to understand, a policeman, they have so much power. They have so much power. And I know that that's a big discussion point right now, is to take some of that power away, because they literally have the power of life in their hands. I personally believe that there needs to be more, they say that they're embedded in the community, but true embeddedness in a community means you live in the community. I think they need to live in the community like it used to be years and years ago. There were local police and everybody knew each other, and you knew the kids growing up to be there, because that's how you start to establish a baseline and you start to establish trust. And beyond that, see a lot throughout all of these police killings is this innate fear that some white men have of Black men. For whatever reason, we're seen as such of a threat to where they go from 0 to 100. There's no slow escalation of a process when they start to have a conversation with someone about something they may have done. It's like Terry, like your example, being right there by U of H. It was 0 to 100 immediately. There was, And then there was no real de-escalation. It was just, oops, our mistake, and they leave, you know. And you know, there are several reasons for that. Now, the innate fear in that regard, that I don't, but there needs to be consequences. Time to police kill people of color and get off scot-free. Go back to work even. If you have the power of life in your hands and you know that, you know, the union is going to rally around that, at the end of the day, there's a very strong possibility that, you know, you're going to be acquitted and go back to work. Then why would you stop doing what you're doing?
And let's keep in mind too, if you don't mind me jumping in, what Bruce is saying, and let's keep in mind the fact that we've been referencing stories that have made the news. So, you know, which are not that, you know, there's way too many, but there's a whole lot of people that this happens to that we never hear about. And again, this is not the stuff that's happening that we're talking about that's led to all these riots. These aren't new occurrences. These have been going on since Black people have been in this country, by the way. So this is not something that's new. This is not some trend. This is something that has been going on all the time. And there are countless people that we never hear about that this happens to that are Black and brown.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I'll add one finer point here. One of my godsons is 12, and my friend, who's really like my brother, he and I were having a conversation earlier this year, and he said, you know, he's 12 now. I wonder, when will he stop being viewed as a cute kid, and when will they start seeing him as they see you and me? And I instantly knew what he was talking about, because that's a conversation my father, I distinctly remember. I think I was around 14. My dad sat me down and he said something very similar. You know, I didn't mature very fast in my teenage years. And so I had a baby face for a long time. And my dad sat me down and he said, you know, he said, look, there will come a time pretty soon when you're going to start being viewed differently. And we need to talk about how to handle that. And that's a version of the talk that we're talking about, but it's this sense of the criminalization of your being, the terror of just the being of a Black man. That's so much at the root of this. And so I think any solutions probably need to address that kind of psychosis and psychology before going deeper than that.
Bruce, could you tell us your grandfather's name?
Sure, Buster Turner, Buster Turner. You know, I Googled him and I sent the link, I think, to the panelists yesterday. But yeah, I mean, there's even one of them where, you know, they interviewed me to talk about my grandfather. But yeah, he was a great man.
Thank you. We have several questions, but we are also at 5:30, so I'll leave it to you guys if you want to stay on and address these questions, or if you have other commitments that you need to get to.
I can stay on a few minutes longer, Laura.
Okay. Our Madam Mayor Pro Tem, Andrea Bearfield, first, thank you for your honesty. She shared her thanks. And also that it is imperative for us to move from emotional to activated. That happens in the polls and in completing your census. Her question is, what is your industry doing as it relates to equitable practices in the way that they lead? And also, I think sharing that with the group, like everyone in this organization must ask that question. Do you guys have examples of things in your industry?
Well, the legal industry is notoriously bad for these practices, even though we'd like to believe otherwise. Our firm, small that it is, but we do have a set of policies that I'm happy to share offline.
Yeah. And speaking about, again, notorious and its history, but I'm on our Diversity and Inclusion Council, and I'd like to believe my firm was so progressive that the first time I tried to apply for the council, I didn't even get in. And I was like, there are that many people, black, white, and what have you, that want to be involved to where I get rejected year one. That must mean that this is pretty serious here. But even taking it a step further, an email came out from our CEO earlier today, was that he is committed to, first and foremost, we had a racial equity discussion, a town hall, firm-wide, all 600 employees last Friday, and I shared a few of my moments. And he made it a point to have every partner of the firm and every C-suite member on that call, on that town hall discussion. They had to be there. Like that was part of their next year's bonus requirement. So, and beyond that, we have a meeting on Friday to talk about how do we improve our ability to bring in more Black and brown analysts, to hire more, and then look at lateral hirings for every level of the firm, because we want to reflect the communities that we work with nation.
Thanks, Bruce. Anyone else have examples they want to share? Okay. Terry, I'm going to turn it over to you to wrap up.
Yeah, I just want to basically say thank you. Well, not basically, but explicitly say thank you to everyone who's here today. I know it's a commitment of time, and I appreciate that you've given us some of your time. I definitely want to thank Laura. Laura is if nothing, she's nothing if not persuasive and persistent. And I just appreciate her vision to want to engage in this way. I think beyond now, I mean, how we saw this conversation shaping up was a conversation to set the stage for other and future conversations. And I will ask the same in those conversations as we move, as Andrea said, as we move from emotion to action. I'll ask the same thing in those future conversations, which is that we bring empathy and grace to those conversations, and we do it in the highest and most noble sense of what the Lyceum is. And so with that, I'll thank you for your time and wish you a good evening, and I wish we had a happy hour or something to go to together. So if anyone can open a hospitality suite tonight, I'm there. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.